In evaluating today's round, GMOs need to be both sustainable so we can see long-term impacts, and they also need to be accessible for these benefits to materialize. Remember that even if they prove that we technically could achieve food security with GMOs, they also need to prove that they're essential and that they're not just simply efficient, but that they're actually essential and you can't do it without GMOs. They say that they only need to prove a piece of the puzzle, but don't let them say that we need, for instance, one specific type of GMO. They need to prove some sort of net benefit from GMOs, whereas if we show you that alternatives like hybrids can do the same thing or better, then clearly they're not going to be essential. With that in mind, let's move to the first major issue in today's round, which is sustainability. Our opponents keep on claiming this increase of yields. However, we've established that through humanists that we actually do produce enough food in the status quo. It's just distribution errors that causes the projected 70% increase in food availability that our opponents say that we actually need. If we were to improve distribution, for instance, if we were to reduce food waste by about a third, we would able to be compensating for that. Remember that only about 2% is consumed, for instance, like soy is consumed directly, whereas for instance, much of the other GMOs are used for either factory farms like livestock or biofuels, meaning that they're not actually going to be that hard to replace. The 80% is only cropland in the United States. It's not about how much the United States relies upon GMOs. But then more yields doesn't necessarily equal food security, which is their main link into preserving the land. Remember that they themselves don't meet the 70% that they say is necessary, but instead if you look to Jay Pretty, he finds that sustainable techniques like sustainable agriculture, like agroecology, like crop rotation, like organic agriculture, increase yields on net by about 79%. Our opponents say we cherry pick this study, but it just happens to be that the studies that he analyzed were successful, not that he only analyzed successful interventions. Remember that the net benefit that they talk about is only about 22 to 65%, depending on what study you look at. We outweigh right there. But furthermore, you would prefer our study over theirs because we indicted Brooks and Barfoot as well as Kompler, and saying that they were funded by Monsanto, they cherry pick data that's not long term if they only study one season, as well as all these other real world examples. For instance, in India, where we saw a 40% decrease in yield, Argentina, South Africa, and Indonesia, which all saw similar alternatives. For instance, disease resistance, even if you want to talk about that, we also have the same alternatives like cassavas or potatoes that can do the exact same thing without the negative harms coming from GMOs. Furthermore, these traits simply don't last. So even if you see a small increase in yields because of whatever resistance in the status quo, you're not going to see it in the future because it's super short term. Remember, they say that we're not really going to be seeing these super pests, but if you look over the last 20 years, we've seen 24 more herbicide-resistant superweeds develop as a direct result of GMOs, for instance. But then we're seeing this at a far faster rate because GMOs incentivize farmers to use far more pesticides, far more herbicides. In terms of the climate change argument, that our opponents talk about this green wall in terms of China, that's just planting vegetation between China and the desert. It doesn't have to be GMOs and isn't GMOs. But then remember that methane rice can also be achieved through hybrids, and rice hybrids decrease water consumption by 50%, which is greater than our opponent's number. We're easily achieving all of these. And then in terms of the monoculture argument, our opponents basically say it's non-unique, but we're actually going to be worsening monoculture and incentivizing it because there are fewer varieties of GMOs available. Look to the example of South Africa. We went from 12 to 4 varieties of seeds after the implementation of GMOs. Now let's move on to the fish argument. The health benefits are highly suspect. They never prove that this is going to be solving for or stopping overfishing. It's just their own analysis because they say that salmon is 2 times larger and requires fewer feed. And remember, we show you that catch share is far more important and can easily alleviate the issue of overfishing by itself. Let's move on to the soil degradation argument. Remember, they never contest that vector DNA is going to be harmful, and their sole example for saying no environmental harms is talking about BT alone, whereas vector DNA occur for all types of crops, and in the long term is what causes its reduction in soil diversity and thus production. In terms of no-till farming, it's completely non-unique. For instance, the Scientific American explains that we've been adopting it since the 1960s, and there are countless farms in the US and other countries that have no-till without GMOs. Now let's move on to the access debate. What's most important when our opponents drop is that the countries and regions that adopt GMOs aren't going to be benefited because they're actually turning towards export commercialized agriculture, which they're producing the wrong crops and aren't adapting to the local culture. These aren't crops that the local people can eat, whereas hybrids, for instance, in places like Mexico, India, and Europe are far more accessible. We're only undermining local foods by displacing thousands. For instance, in Argentina, we displaced 60,000, and most of the farmers use these GMs for self-sustenance, so how are they getting this increased income? In fact, distribution is going to be the main cause. The UN says that solving for 1/3 of it would help alleviate this food insecurity, and we're showing that they simply can't afford the food because, for instance, farmer incomes are actually going to be harmed on net. We indicted the 2 studies that they provide, Brooks and Barfoot and Klumpner, and in actuality, you see decreased profits because these Monsanto and other organisms are hiking up the cost. In the women argument, they never link into education. Hybrids actually increase labor increase labor efficiency by 50%, which is far more than our opponent's number. And at the end, we're only seeing monopolies, and thus we gain.